Sometimes the hardest thing in life is learning to trust after you've lost everything. When aging Montana rancher Walt Granger found a giant dog at his gate one frozen morning, a note tied to its collar read, "Please take care of him. He's all I had." Walt was grieving his wife, estranged from his children, and the last thing he wanted was another soul to care for. But this dog was different. Patient, wise, knowing when Walt needed silence and when he needed company. As Walt pieced together who left the dog and why, he uncovered a dying man's final act of love. What could make a stranger entrust their precious companion to a grieving cowboy they'd never met? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Walt Granger stood at his kitchen window, watching the first light break over the Bitterroot Mountains. The coffee in his mug, Emma's old ceramic one with the faded wildflowers, had gone cold again. He did this most mornings now, held her cup without drinking from it, as if the weight of it in his hands could somehow anchor him to the life they'd built together. The ranch had been in the Granger family for 3 generations. 140 acres of Montana foothill country, where the land rolled gentle before rising sharp into pine-covered slopes. Walt's grandfather had cleared the first fields with a team of draft horses and his own 2 hands. His father had added the barn and the cattle operation. Walt had kept it going through droughts and hard winters, through the lean years when beef prices dropped and the bank came calling. Now, at 72, he stood alone in a house that echoed. Emma had passed in early October, just as the aspen leaves turned gold. Cancer had taken her quick at the end, after fighting slow for 2 years. Walt had held her hand in the bedroom upstairs while she slipped away, the morphine making her dreams soft and painless. She'd squeezed his fingers one last time and whispered something he couldn't quite hear. He'd leaned close, asked her to say it again, but she was already gone. That was 4 months ago. The grief sat in his chest like a stone. He set the mug down carefully on the counter, running his thumb over the chip on the rim where Emma had dropped it years ago. She'd wanted to throw it out, but Walt had told her it added character. Now he couldn't imagine drinking from anything else, even though he rarely drank from it at all. The ranch house was a 2-story farmhouse, white clapboard siding that needed paint, a wraparound porch where Emma had kept flowers in the summer. Inside, everything remained exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses on the side table, her quilting basket by the old rocking chair, the calendar on the wall still turned to October. Because Walt couldn't bring himself to flip the page, he pulled on his work coat, the heavy Carhartt that smelled like hay and diesel, and stepped out into the February cold. The temperature hovered around 15 degrees, the kind of cold that bit through your clothes and found your bones. Snow covered everything in a thick white blanket, pristine except for the tracks he'd made doing morning chores. The livestock needed tending. 16 head of cattle in the near pasture, 2 horses in the barn, Shadow and Dusty, both getting on in years like Walt himself. He'd scaled back the operation after Emma got sick, sold off most of the herd, kept just enough to maintain the place, to give himself reason to get up each morning. His breath plumed white in the frigid air as he crossed the yard toward the barn. The snow crunched under his boots, that particular sound winter makes when it's cold enough to turn moisture into tiny crystals. Above, the sky stretched endless and blue, the kind of clear morning that promised bitter cold all day. Walt had been born in this valley, grew up riding these hills, learned to rope and brand and mend fence before he was 12. He'd left once, spent 2 years in the army down in Texas, but the mountains had called him home. He'd married Emma Peterson when he was 23. She was a schoolteacher's daughter from Missoula, and they'd raised 2 children in this house. Michael, their oldest, lived in Seattle now. Software engineer, made good money, had a wife and 2 kids Walt barely knew. They'd talked on the phone after Emma's funeral, brief and stilted, Michael promising to visit soon. That was 4 months ago. The visit hadn't happened. Sarah, their daughter, lived in Denver. She'd come for the funeral, stayed a week, but there'd been tension between them. Old wounds that hadn't healed. She'd wanted Walt to sell the ranch, move into town where he'd be closer to doctors and people. Walt had refused. The argument had been quiet but firm, and Sarah had left with hurt in her eyes. He hadn't heard from her since Thanksgiving. The barn door groaned as Walt pulled it open. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of hay and horse. Shadow nickered softly, a grey gelding with white speckles who'd been Walt's riding horse for 15 years. Dusty, a bay mare Emma had favoured, stood quiet in her stall. Walt went through the motions, filled water buckets from the frost-free hydrant, threw down fresh hay, checked hooves and ran his hands over warm flanks, looking for any sign of trouble. The horses were good company. They didn't talk, didn't ask questions, didn't expect anything beyond food and water and the occasional kind word. After the horses, he broke ice in the cattle trough and scattered feed in the pasture. The cows moved slow in the cold, their breath steaming, their dark shapes stark against the white landscape. Walt counted them out of habit. All present, all moving well. By the time he finished, the sun had climbed higher, though it gave little warmth. Walt's fingers were numb inside his gloves. He headed back toward the house, thinking about breakfast he probably wouldn't eat, about the hours that stretched ahead with nothing to fill them. That's when he saw the dog. It sat just outside the front gate, perfectly still like a statue carved from the winter itself. Walt stopped mid-stride, squinting against the snow's glare. The dog was massive, easily 150 pounds, maybe more. Its coat was thick and shaggy, a mix of grey and black and white that made it look like a wolf. But there was something gentle in the way it sat, patient and calm, with no aggression in its posture. Walt approached slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. The dog didn't move, just watched him with dark, intelligent eyes. As Walt got closer, he noticed a red bandana tied around the dog's neck, and something else, a piece of paper, folded and secured under the bandana with string. "Easy now," Walt said softly, stopping a few feet away. "Where'd you come from?" The dog's tail moved slightly, a small wag that seemed almost polite. Walt had been around animals his whole life, could read their moods and intentions. This dog meant no harm. If anything, it looked hopeful, waiting for something. Walt knelt down in the snow, his knees protesting, and reached out slowly. The dog leaned forward, let Walt's hand touch its head. The fur was soft, despite its wild appearance, warm beneath Walt's cold fingers. He worked the string loose and pulled out the note. The paper was cheap, torn from a spiral notebook, and the handwriting was shaky, written in pencil that had pressed hard into the page. "Please take care of him. He's all I had, that was it." No name, no explanation, no signature. Just 7 words that carried the weight of a world. Walt read it again, his throat tightening. He looked at the dog, who gazed back at him with those steady dark eyes, and something in Walt's chest cracked open. This animal had been someone's everything. Someone had loved this dog enough to make sure it found a home, even as they faced their own end. Walt knew that kind of love. Knew what it meant to hold something precious and know you had to let it go. "Come on then," he said, his voice rough. He stood, joints aching, and opened the gate. The dog rose gracefully and walked through, staying close to Walt's side as they headed toward the house. It moved with dignity, not rushing, not hesitant, just steady and sure. Inside, Walt filled a large bowl with water and set it on the kitchen floor. The dog drank deeply, then sat back on its haunches and looked at Walt with what could only be described as gratitude. Walt opened the refrigerator, found some leftover roast beef from 2 days ago, and set it down. The dog ate slowly, carefully, not gulping like a starved animal, but savoring each bite. Walt pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, the note still in his hand. He studied the handwriting, looking for clues. The letters trembled, suggesting either age or illness. The paper was worn, had been folded and unfolded multiple times, as if the writer had labored over those 7 words. "He's all I had." Walt understood that feeling too well. After Emma died, after the kids had gone back to their separate lives, Walt had felt the emptiness of this house pressing down on him. He'd considered getting a dog, actually, something for company, but he'd decided against it. didn't want to care for anything else that might die and leave him alone again. Now here sat this animal, uninvited but somehow necessary, filling a space Walt hadn't admitted was empty. The dog finished eating and came to sit beside Walt's chair, resting its enormous head on Walt's knee. The weight of it was solid and real, and Walt found his hand moving automatically to scratch behind the dog's ears. "What am I supposed to call you?" Walt asked. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Walt thought about it. The dog had the bearing of something noble, something old and wise. Its eyes held a depth that reminded Walt of the mountains themselves. Ancient, patient, knowing. "Timber," Walt said finally. "That work for you?" The dog's tail thumped again, stronger this time, and Walt felt something he hadn't felt in months. A small flicker of warmth in his chest, like embers stirring in cold ash. Outside, the Montana winter held the land in its grip, white and silent and endless. But inside the old farmhouse, Walt Granger sat with his hand on a dog's head, holding a stranger's final words, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was how healing began. Not with grand gestures or profound realizations, but with simple presence, with the weight of a loyal head on your knee, and the knowledge that something, somewhere still needed you. Walt looked down at Timber, and Timber looked back, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them that needed no words at all. 3 days passed before Walt noticed the collar. He'd been keeping Timber. The name had stuck without any conscious decision, and the dog had settled into the ranch routine with an ease that surprised him. Timber followed Walt on morning chores, waited patiently by the barn while Walt tended the horses, and lay by the wood stove in the evenings while Walt pretended to read books he couldn't focus on. It was during one of those evenings, with firelight casting shadows across the living room, that Walt saw it. He'd been absently stroking Timber's neck when his fingers caught on something beneath the thick fur, a leather collar, worn smooth with age, hidden under the red bandana. Walt worked his fingers under the bandana and found the buckle. The collar was old, the leather cracked and soft from years of wear. As he unclasped it and brought it into the light, he saw letters carved into the leather, crude but deliberate. J.C. 2019, initials and a date. 6 years ago, someone named J.C. had marked this collar, claimed this dog as their own. Walt turned the collar over in his hand, studying every detail. The leather was good quality, hand-tooled with a simple pattern around the edges. This hadn't come from a pet store. Someone had made this, or had it made special. Someone who cared. He looked at Timber, who watched him with those steady dark eyes. "J.C.," Walt said aloud. "That mean anything to you?" Timber's tail thumped once against the floor. Walt stood and walked to the kitchen, where he'd placed the note in a drawer. He pulled it out, spread it on the counter, studied the shaky handwriting again. "Please take care of him. He's all I had. 2 clues now. Not much, but more than nothing. Initials and a plea." The question that had been sitting in the back of Walt's mind since that first morning crystallized into something sharp and urgent. Who was J.C., and what had happened to make them give up their dog? Walt had told himself he was just keeping Timber temporarily, until he could find where the dog belonged. But 3 days in, he knew that was a lie. He was keeping Timber because the house felt less empty with the dog in it, because having something to care for gave shape to his days. Still, the mystery nagged at him. Someone out there had loved this animal enough to ensure its safety, even in their darkest hour. That deserved acknowledgement, deserved answers. The next morning, Walt drove into Millerville, the small town 20 miles north where he did his shopping and banking. The truck rattled over the gravel road, Timber sitting in the passenger seat with his head out the window despite the cold, his ears blown back by the wind. Millerville was the kind of town that time had mostly forgotten. One main street with a grocery, a hardware store, a diner, and a handful of other businesses that barely survived. The post office occupied a brick building at the center of town, and next door sat the sheriff's office. Walt parked in front of the sheriff's office and left Timber in the truck, with the windows cracked. Inside, Deputy Karen Mills sat behind the front desk working on paperwork. She looked up when the door opened, and her face softened with recognition. "Walt," she said, standing. "Good to see you." Karen was in her mid-40s, a transplant from Bozeman who joined the department 5 years back. She'd been kind during Emma's illness, had checked on Walt a few times after the funeral. He appreciated that she didn't pry, didn't push, Karen, Walt said, nodding. He approached the desk, pulling the collar from his coat pocket. "I've got something of a situation. Hoping you might help." He explained about finding timber at his gate, about the note, about the collar with the initials. Karen listened carefully, her professional attention sharpening as he spoke. "J.C., she repeated, taking the collar and examining it. "And you found the dog 3 days ago?" "Friday morning. Been keeping him since, but I figure someone out there might be looking for him, or at least ought to know he's safe." Karen walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "Let me check missing persons, see if anything recent matches." She flipped through papers, her brow furrowed. After a few minutes, she shook her head. "Nothing in the last month. No reports of missing dogs either, though folks don't always report that." "The note," Walt said quietly. "The way it was written. I don't think this person is missing. I think they're gone." Karen met his eyes, understanding passing between them. "You think they passed away?" "I do." She set the collar down carefully. "That makes this harder. If they died at home, we might not know about it. If they were alone, could be days or weeks before anyone found them." She paused. "You said the dog was at your gate specifically?" "Right outside it. Like he'd been told to go there and wait, so whoever left him knew where you lived. Knew your ranch." Walt hadn't considered that. The thought made him uneasy, not threatened, but puzzled. He didn't have many visitors, didn't socialize much even before Emma died. Who would know him well enough to trust him with their dying wish? "I can make some calls," Karen said. "Check with the county, see if there were any recent deaths that fit. It might take a few days." "Appreciate it," Walt said. He took the collar back, the leather warm from Karen's hands. "I'll keep the dog meanwhile." "He's no trouble," Karen smiled slightly. "I heard you'd been pretty isolated out there. Maybe some company isn't such a bad thing." Walt didn't respond to that, just nodded his thanks and left. Outside, Timber had his nose pressed to the truck window, breath fogging the glass. When Walt climbed in, the dog's tail wagged, and Walt felt that same small warmth in his chest, the kind he'd been trying not to examine too closely. They drove to Morrison's Feed and Supply on the edge of town. Walt needed dog food, proper supplies if Timber was going to stay for any length of time. Inside, the store smelled like grain and leather, familiar and comforting. Old Jim Morrison stood behind the counter, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Walt Granger," Jim said. "Been a while." "Jim." Walt grabbed a cart and headed for the dog section. He selected a large bag of quality food, some rawhide chews, a proper water bowl. Jim watched with interest as Walt unloaded everything at the counter. "Didn't know you had a dog," Jim said, ringing up the items. "Recent development," Walt replied. He hesitated, then pulled out the collar. "You know anyone around here with the initials J.C.? Maybe someone who died recently?" Jim studied the collar, his expression thoughtful. "J.C.," he repeated slowly. "Can't say it rings a bell right off, but I'll think on it." "Why do you ask?" Walt explained about finding timber, about the note. Jim listened with the careful attention of someone who'd lived in small towns all his life, who understood that stories mattered. "That's a heavy thing," Jim said when Walt finished. "Someone trusting you like that." He handed back the collar. "I'll ask around, quiet-like. If anyone knows about a J.C., word'll get back to you." Walt paid for the supplies and loaded them in the truck. Timber sniffed the new food bag with approval, and they headed back toward the ranch. The drive home took them past the old cemetery at the edge of town. Walt slowed without meaning to, his eyes drawn to the iron gates and the stone markers beyond. Emma was buried there, in a plot beside his parents and grandparents. He hadn't been back since the funeral. Timber made a soft sound, almost a whine, and Walt realized he'd stopped the truck entirely, idling on the side of the road while he stared at the cemetery gates. "I know," Walt said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the dog or to himself. "I should visit," but he put the truck in gear and drove on. Some things were still too raw, too fresh. some graves he wasn't ready to stand before. Back at the ranch, Walt unloaded the supplies and fed Timber from the new bag. The dog ate with his usual careful dignity, then followed Walt outside for afternoon chores. The sun was starting its descent, painting the snow gold and orange, and the temperature was dropping fast. Walt worked methodically, checked the cattle, threw hay, broke ice in the water trough. Timber stayed close, not in the way but present, a solid shadow at Walt's side. There was something reassuring about it, about having another living thing share the work. That night, Walt sat at the kitchen table with the collar and the note spread before him. JC, someone out there, someone who'd reached the end of their road and had one last thing to do, make sure their dog was safe. Someone who'd chosen Walt Granger, a grieving rancher they somehow knew, to carry that burden. Why him? That question gnawed at Walt more than the mystery of JC's identity. Why had this person, in their final act, decided Walt was the right choice? Timber came and rested his head on Walt's knee again, and Walt stroked the dog's ears absently. "Your person," he said softly. "They must have been something special. To raise a dog like you." Timber's tail thumped once, and in that small movement, Walt felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. This wasn't just about keeping a dog anymore. This was about honoring someone's final wish, about bearing witness to a life that had ended alone enough that giving away a beloved pet had been the last option. Walt didn't know who JC was yet, but he was going to find out. And when he did, he'd make sure their trust hadn't been misplaced. Outside, the Montana night closed in, cold and clear and full of stars. Inside, Walt Granger sat with a stranger's dog and a stranger's secrets, and felt the first stirrings of purpose he'd known in months. The phone rang on Sunday morning while Walt was frying eggs. He stared at it for 3 rings before answering, already knowing it would be one of the kids. Nobody else called anymore. The number on the display confirmed it. Sarah. "Calling from Denver. Hello," Walt said. A phone wedged between his shoulder and ear while he flipped an egg. "Dad." Sarah's voice carried that particular tension it always held when talking to him. Careful, measured, like she was walking on ice. "How are you?" "I'm fine. You?" "Good, we're good." A pause. "I just wanted to check in. It's been a while, since Thanksgiving," Walt thought. Since the argument about the ranch. But he didn't say that. "Appreciate the call." Another pause, longer this time. Walt could hear voices in the background, Sarah's husband maybe, or the kids. Her life in Denver, full and busy and far away from this valley. "Dad, I've been thinking," Sarah said finally, "about what we discussed. About the ranch, and you being out there alone." Walt turned off the stove. "The eggs could wait." "Sarah, just hear me out, please." Her voice softened. "I'm not trying to control your life. I just worry. It's a big place for one person, especially in winter. What if something happened? What if you fell or got sick? I'm 72, not 92. I can manage. I know you can. But why should you have to? There are nice places in town, Dad. Communities where you'd have people around, where you wouldn't have to do all this work every day." Walt looked out the window at the barn, at the mountains beyond. 3 generations of Grangers had worked this land. His grandfather's sweat was in the soil. His father's hands had built half these structures. Emma's flowers had bloomed in the garden every summer for 40 years. "This is my home," he said quietly. "It's too much for one person." Maybe it is. Walt surprised himself by agreeing. "But it's mine to manage." Sarah sighed, and Walt heard the frustration in it. She meant well, he knew that. She was scared of losing him, scared of him dying alone out here where nobody would find him for days. But she didn't understand that leaving would be a different kind of death, a slow erasure of everything that had made his life worth living. "I got a dog," Walt said, changing the subject, silence on the other end. "Then you got a dog?" "Big fellow. Showed up at my gate about a week ago. Dad, that's—" She paused, reconsidering whatever she'd been about to say. "That's good. That's really good. What's his name?" "Timber." "I'm glad," Sarah said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I'm glad you have company. They talked for a few more minutes, surface conversation about weather and Sarah's kids and work. When they hung up, Walt felt the familiar mix of love and frustration that his daughter always stirred in him. She cared, he never doubted that. But caring and understanding weren't the same thing. Timber had been lying by the wood stove during the call. Now he came over and pressed against Walt's leg, solid and warm, as if sensing the emotional toll of the conversation. "You're good at that," Walt said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Knowing when folks need steadying, the egg had gone cold on the stove. Walt fed it to Timber instead and made himself oatmeal. As he ate, he thought about Sarah's words, about being alone. He had been alone these past months, isolated in his grief. But having Timber here had shifted something, opened a space he hadn't realized was closed. After breakfast, Walt bundled up and headed out with Timber for a walk along the fence line. The morning was clear, but bitterly cold, the kind of day where the air itself seemed to crack with frost. Timber bounded through the snow with obvious joy, his thick coat protecting him from the temperature. They walked the northern boundary, Walt checking fence posts and wire, while Timber investigated rabbit tracks and deer trails. It was good to move, good to have purpose beyond the daily survival of chores. Walt realized he'd been moving through the days since Emma's death like a ghost himself. Going through motions without truly inhabiting them, Timber stopped suddenly, ears pricked forward, staring at something in the tree line. Walt followed his gaze but saw nothing, just pine trees heavy with snow, shadows and light playing tricks. "What is it?" Walt asked. Timber remained still for a long moment, then relaxed and continued walking. Whatever he'd sensed had passed or proven harmless. Walt had noticed this about the dog. Timber was alert without being nervous, watchful without being afraid. It suggested training, or at least a life lived outdoors where awareness meant survival. Who had raised this dog? Who was JC, and what kind of life had they lived together? These questions followed Walt as they completed the fence check and headed back toward the ranch. He'd heard nothing from Deputy Mills yet. No word from Jim Morrison about anyone matching the initials. The trail was cold, and maybe it would stay that way. Maybe JC would remain a mystery, a ghost defined only by their final act of love. Back at the house, Walt spent the afternoon doing paperwork, ranch accounts, bills, the endless administrative burden of keeping a property running. Timber lay on the floor beside the desk, occasionally sighing in that way dogs do when they're perfectly content. Emma used to help with this work. She'd had a head for numbers, could see patterns in the accounts that Walt missed. Without her, everything took twice as long and felt half as accurate. He caught himself starting to ask her opinion about a feed invoice, actually turned toward her empty chair before remembering. The grief hit him in waves like that, unexpected and sharp. He'd be fine for hours, even days, and then something small, a scent, a sound, the angle of light through a window, would bring her back so vividly he could almost hear her voice. And then she'd be gone again, and the loss would be fresh as the day she died. Timber stood and came to Walt's side, resting his head in Walt's lap. The weight and warmth of it anchored Walt, pulled him back from the edge of sorrow. "You do that a lot," Walt said, his voice rough. "Show up right when I need you." That evening, as the sun set and the temperature plummeted, Walt made a fire and settled into his reading chair with a book he'd been trying to finish for weeks. Timber stretched out on the floor nearby, his breathing deep and even. Walt found himself watching the dog instead of reading. There was something almost human in Timber's expressions, in the way his eyebrows moved and his eyes tracked motion. This wasn't just a well-trained animal. This was a companion, a friend who'd been raised with love and attention. JC had given up everything, their companionship, their daily routine, their connection, to ensure Timber's safety. What kind of desperation drove a person to that? What kind of loneliness? Walt set the book aside and pulled out the note again. He'd read it so many times he had it memorized, but still he studied the words, looking for something he'd missed. "Please take care of him. He's all I had, all." The word carried weight. Not one of the things I had, but all. Everything. The sum total of what mattered in JC's life had been this dog, and they'd trusted Walt, A stranger as far as Walt knew to honor that. It was trust that Walt found both humbling and burdensome. He thought about what Sarah had said, about being alone, about communities and company. Maybe J.C. had lived like Walt, isolated and self-sufficient, until the end came and there was no one to call, no family to lean on. Just a dog and a desperate need to ensure it would be safe. Walt looked at Timber, who gazed back with those steady, dark eyes. "I'll do right by you," Walt said quietly. "Your person, whoever they were. I'll make sure their trust wasn't wasted." Timber's tail thumped twice against the floor. And outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves. The Montana winter held everything in its grasp, cold and relentless. But inside the old farmhouse, warmth held firm. A fire crackled. A dog slept. And the man who'd been drifting found himself tethered to purpose again. Bound by a promise to a stranger he'd never met on Tuesday, Walt found the photograph while cleaning out the hall closet. He'd been avoiding this task for months, but Timber had somehow managed to pull down Emma's old winter coat, and Walt decided it was time to sort through things. He'd been living around Emma's belongings like they were museum exhibits, afraid to touch them, afraid that moving anything would erase her presence entirely. The photograph had fallen from the coat pocket, a Polaroid, faded and creased. Walt and Emma, probably 40 years ago, standing in front of the barn during its construction. Emma wore jeans and one of Walt's flannel shirts, her hair tied back, a hammer in her hand. Walt stood beside her, younger, stronger, grinning at the camera with an ease he barely recognized now. He remembered that day. They'd been married 5 years, still learning each other, still building their life together. Michael had been a toddler, napping in the house. Sarah hadn't been born yet. The barn had been Walt's project, something he was determined to build with his own hands, like his father had done. Emma had insisted on helping. She'd mixed concrete, held boards steady while Walt hammered, worked alongside him until her hands blistered. Later, she'd joke that the barn stood because she'd been there to keep Walt from cutting corners. He'd never admitted she was right, but they both knew she was. Walt sat down on the closet floor, holding the photograph, and felt time collapse around him. That young couple in the picture had their whole lives ahead, the good years and the hard ones, the children who would grow and leave, the quiet mornings over coffee, the gradual accumulation of shared history that made two people into one unit. And now Emma was gone, and Walt was old, and the barn still stood. Timber came and sat beside him, pressing close. Walt showed him the photograph, knowing the dog couldn't understand but needing to share it anyway. "That's Emma," he said softly. "My wife. She was stubborn and smart and never let me get away with feeling sorry for myself." His voice cracked. "I miss her every day." Timber leaned harder against Walt's side, and Walt wrapped an arm around the dog's thick neck. Holding on like Timber was the only solid thing in a shifting world. After a while, Walt stood, knees protesting, and placed the photograph on the mantel in the living room. Emma deserved to be visible, to be part of the house again, instead of hidden away. He looked at her young face, at his own young face, and felt something shift inside him, not the grief lessening, but his relationship to it changing. Maybe it was time to stop living in a museum. Maybe Emma would have wanted him to move forward, to let life in again. That afternoon, Deputy Mills called. "Walt, I've got something," she said. "Might be nothing, but worth checking out. There was a death about 6 weeks ago up near Beargrass Creek. Man named Joseph Carver, lived alone in a cabin. Coroner ruled it natural causes, heart failure. He was 78, Joseph Carver." J.C. Walt's hand tightened on the phone. "Anyone claim the body?" "No next of kin on file. County handled the burial. But here's the thing. The responding officer noted in his report that there was no dog at the scene, but there were dog bowls and a leash. They figured maybe the dog ran off. Where's the cabin?" "About 15 miles northwest of your place, up in the hills. It's remote, no neighbors for miles. I can give you directions if you want to check it out." Walt wrote down the information, his hand steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Thanks, Karen. Let me know what you find." After hanging up, Walt stood in his kitchen, staring at the note on the counter. Joseph Carver, a man who'd lived alone, died alone, and in his final hours or days had managed to ensure his dog would be safe. Had managed somehow to get Timber to Walt's gate. But how? If Carver had been dying, if he'd lived 15 miles away, how had he gotten Timber to the ranch? Walt looked at Timber, who sat watching him with those intelligent eyes. "You walked it, didn't you? He told you where to go, and you walked 15 miles through winter to get here." Timber's tail wagged once, and Walt felt his throat tighten. The loyalty required for that, the training and trust. It spoke to years of companionship between man and dog. Years of building a relationship so strong that even dying, Carver had known Timber would follow his last instruction. Walt decided to visit the cabin the next day. He needed to see where Carver had lived, needed to understand who this man had been. But first, he had evening chores, and with the new knowledge sitting heavy in his chest. The work felt different, felt like preparation for something. Though Walt couldn't say what, he and Timber went out into the cold. The cattle needed hay, the horses needed tending, and the work grounded Walt, gave him something concrete to do with his hands, while his mind worked through what he'd learned. As Walt spread hay in the pasture, he thought about lonely men and the choices they made. Carver had lived alone by choice or by circumstance, had built a life in the mountains with only a dog for company. When the end came, he'd had no one to call, no family to arrange things. Just a dog he loved and a need to ensure it would survive him. How had Carver known about Walt? That question bothered him more than any other. They'd never met as far as Walt knew. Their ranches weren't close. Yet Carver had trusted Walt specifically, had somehow known that Walt would take care of Timber. Back inside, Walt made dinner, venison stew from meat in the freezer, bread from the store. He fed Timber, and then sat at the table with his own bowl, eating slowly while the dog rested at his feet. Emma's photograph watched him from the mantel. Walt found himself talking to it the way he'd talked to her empty chair for months. "There's a man I never met who trusted me with his dog," he said. "Joseph Carver. Lived up near Beargrass Creek and died alone. I'm going to go see his place tomorrow. Try to figure out why he chose me." The photograph didn't answer, but in his mind, Walt could hear Emma's voice. "Maybe he saw something in you that you can't see in yourself." Emma had always believed Walt was better than he thought he was. Kinder, stronger, more capable. She'd spent 40 years trying to make him see himself through her eyes. Walt had never quite managed it, but he'd loved her for trying. He cleaned up the dinner dishes and sat in his chair by the fire. Timber came and rested his head on Walt's knee, and they stayed like that for a long time, man and dog, both carrying the ghosts of people they'd loved, both trying to figure out how to keep living when the world felt smaller and colder than it used to. "Tomorrow, we'll go see where you came from," Walt said quietly. "Maybe find some answers." Timber's tail thumped against the floor, and outside, the wind picked up again, carrying snow against the windows. Winter in Montana was a long, hard season, but Walt had lived through enough of them to know that spring always came eventually. You just had to hold on, had to keep the fire burning, had to trust that the cold wouldn't last forever. He looked at Emma's photograph, at her young smile and capable hands, and then at the dog pressed against his leg, and felt something like gratitude. For the first time since Emma's death, Walt wasn't just surviving. He was living again, pulled forward by purpose and the weight of another person's trust. Joseph Carver had given him that, had given him a reason to get up, to search for answers, to connect with the world beyond his grief. It was a strange gift from a stranger, but Walt was beginning to understand that the best gifts often were. The road to Joseph Carver's cabin was barely a road at all. Walt's truck bounced over frozen ruts and exposed rock, climbing into the foothills through stands of pine and aspen. Snow lay deep here, untouched except for animal tracks. Timber sat in the passenger seat, alert and watching, as if recognizing the route. "You remember this, don't you?" Walt said. "Coming down this road." Timber made a soft sound, not quite a whine, and Walt reached over to scratch behind his ears. The dog had to have made this journey alone, walking through winter cold to reach Walt's ranch. The thought of it, Timber following his owner's final command with absolute faith, made Walt's chest ache. The cabin appeared after 40 minutes of driving, tucked into a small clearing with the mountains rising sharp behind it. It was a simple structure, one room with a loft, built from logs and chinked with moss. A small porch fronted the cabin, and beside it stood a shed for firewood and tools. No power lines ran to the property, no phone poles. This was backcountry living at its most basic. Walt parked and stepped out, Timber immediately at his side. The cold up here was sharper than down in the valley, the air thinner. Everything was silent, the kind of deep quiet that only winter in the mountains could produce. The cabin door wasn't locked. Walt pushed it open and stepped inside, Timber following close. The interior was neat, almost austere. A wood stove stood cold in one corner. A narrow bed carefully made. A table and chair by the window. Shelves lined one wall, holding books and supplies. Everything was orderly. The space of someone who lived deliberately, who'd pared life down to essentials. But it was also clearly the home of someone who'd lived with a dog. A large bed sat near the stove, worn but clean. Water and food bowls stood by the door. A leash hung on a peg. Photographs pinned to the wall showed Timber at various ages, as a puppy, as a young dog, in the summer and winter, always with the mountains in the background. Walt walked slowly through the space, taking it in. Joseph Carver had lived here alone, with Timber as his only companion. The books on the shelves were practical, wilderness survival, tracking, foraging, mixed with worn paperback novels. No television, no radio that Walt could see. Just the silence of the mountains and the company of a loyal dog. On the table sat a journal, leather-bound and thick. Walt hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but he'd come for answers. He sat down in the single chair and opened the journal. The handwriting matched the note, the same careful, shaky script. The entries went back years, sporadic at first, then more regular. Walt flipped to the most recent pages and began to read. December 10th. The cold has come early this year. Timber and I walked the ridgeline today. He's getting older, moving a bit slower, but still strong. I'm grateful for every day we have together. December 18th. The pain in my chest has gotten worse. I know what it means. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm afraid of leaving Timber alone. He deserves better than to slowly starve here when I'm gone. Walt's hand tightened on the journal. He kept reading. December 22nd. I've been thinking about what to do. There's a rancher down in the valley, Walt Granger. I've never met him, but I've seen him from a distance. He reminds me of my father, solid, dependable, the kind of man who keeps his word. I've watched his ranch sometimes, through binoculars. He has a good spread, treats his animals well. Lost his wife not long ago. I think he understands grief. Walt stopped breathing. Carver had been watching him, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a man searching for answers, looking for someone trustworthy. December 28th. I've decided. When the time comes, I'll send Timber to Walt Granger. I've trained Timber for years. He knows commands, knows how to travel long distances. I'll tie the note to his collar and he'll go. It's 15 miles, but Timber can make it. He's strong and smart. He'll find the ranch, and Walt will take care of him. I have to believe that. Walt turned the page, his vision blurring. January 3rd. The pain is constant now. I know I don't have much time. I've written the note, tied it to Timber's collar. I've walked him to the edge of the property and pointed him toward the valley. I told him go to Walt, and he looked at me like he understood. I think he knew this was goodbye. He didn't want to leave, but he trusted me. That's the thing about dogs. They trust you completely, even when it breaks their heart. I watched him walk into the trees. He looked back once, and I waved. Then he was gone. I came inside and waited. I hope he makes it. I hope Walt is the man I think he is. The journal ended there. January 3rd, 6 weeks ago. 2 days later, Timber had appeared at Walt's gate. 2 days of walking through winter mountains, following a command from a dying man. Walt sat in the chair, the journal in his hands, and felt the full weight of what Carver had done. He'd sent away the only thing that mattered to him, had died alone to ensure Timber's survival. And he'd chosen Walt, a stranger he'd only observed from a distance, to carry the burden of that trust. Timber had climbed onto his old bed near the stove, curled up in a familiar spot. Walt watched the dog, saw the way Timber's eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the space that had been his home. "He loved you a lot," Walt said quietly. "Your person. He loved you enough to let you go." Timber's tail thumped once against the bed, and Walt saw the understanding in those dark eyes. Dogs grieved too. They mourned loss and remembered love. Walt stood and explored the cabin more thoroughly. In a wooden box under the bed, he found photographs, old ones from Carver's younger years. There was a wedding picture, Carver and a woman in formal clothes, both smiling. Then pictures of the same woman with Carver in various settings over several years. Then nothing. The woman disappeared from the photos. Walt understood. Carver had lost someone too. Maybe that's why he'd come to the mountains, why he'd chosen solitude. Everyone carried their grief differently. In the same box, Walt found military service papers. Joseph Carver, U.S. Army Vietnam veteran, honorably discharged. 2 Purple Hearts. This had been a man who'd served, who'd seen things that probably made civilian life difficult. The mountains had given him peace, and timber had given him purpose. Walt took the journal, careful to wrap it in his coat to protect it from the cold. He'd read it fully, learned more about the man who'd trusted him. It felt important to know Joseph Carver, to understand his life beyond the final, desperate act that had brought Timber to Walt's gate. Before leaving, Walt stood in the center of the cabin and spoke aloud, feeling foolish but needing to say it anyway. "I've got him," Walt said to the empty room, "to the ghost of Joseph Carver. He's safe and he's well cared for. You made a good choice. I'll do right by him." The cabin was silent, but Walt felt a sense of peace settle over him, as if something had been acknowledged and accepted. Outside, Walt loaded Timber into the truck. The dog looked back at the cabin as they drove away, and Walt wondered what animals remembered, what they understood about endings and new beginnings. The drive back to the ranch was quiet. Walt's mind turned over everything he'd learned. Joseph Carver had been a man not unlike Walt, a veteran, a widower, someone who'd found solace in simple work and the company of a loyal animal. He'd lived deliberately and died alone, but he'd made sure his final act was one of love. That evening, Walt sat by the fire with Carver's journal and read it from beginning to end. The early entries were sparse, observations about weather, animals seen, work done. But as the years progressed, the entries grew more personal. Carver wrote about his late wife, about the war, about the peace he'd found in the mountains. He wrote about getting Timber as a puppy, about training him, about the quiet companionship that had sustained him through lonely years, and he wrote about watching Walt from afar, about seeing a kindred spirit in the way Walt worked his ranch, the way he moved through the world after Emma's death. "He's grieving like I grieved," one entry read. "But he has something I didn't. Land that matters, a legacy to maintain. He's not lost yet. Maybe caring for Timber will help him find his way back." Walt closed the journal, his throat tight. Joseph Carver had seen him, really seen him from a distance, through binoculars and across miles of mountain country, had understood Walt's pain and chosen him not despite his grief, but because of it. It was trust of the deepest kind, and Walt felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a sacred obligation. Walt spent the next week reading Carver's journal in the evenings, learning the man's life in pieces. Joseph Carver had grown up in rural Oregon, joined the Army at 19, served 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd met his wife Margaret at a VA hospital where she worked as a nurse. They'd married in 1972, moved to Montana in 1975, bought land near Beargrass Creek. They'd planned to build a life together in the mountains, away from the noise and chaos of the world. Then Margaret had died in 1981, an aneurysm, sudden and merciless. Carver had been 41 years old, his wife 38. The journal entries from that time were brief and raw, pain stripped down to its essentials. After Margaret's death, Carver had stopped writing for nearly 10 years. When the journal resumed, the tone had changed. Carver wrote about solitude, about finding peace in small things, the way light moved through trees, the sound of wind in the canyon, the reliable turn of seasons. And then, in 2019, he wrote about getting a puppy. A rancher down in the valley was selling Anatolian shepherd pups. I drove down and picked one out, the calmest of the litter, with steady eyes and a gentle mouth. I haven't had a dog since I was a boy, but I think it's time. This place is too quiet. A man needs something to care for. Walt had smiled reading that. He understood the impulse, the need for something alive and warm to fill the emptiness. Timber had been Carver's way back to the world, just as Timber was becoming Walt's. The journal detailed Timber's training, his growth from puppy to full-grown dog. Carver had been patient and consistent, building a relationship based on trust and routine. The dog had given Carver purpose, had pulled him out of himself, and now Timber was doing the same for Walt. On Saturday morning, Walt decided to do something he'd been considering since reading the journal. He went out to his workshop, a small building behind the barn, where he kept tools and equipment. Timber followed, as he always did, settling near the wood stove while Walt searched for materials. Walt found a piece of pine board, smooth and clean, and brought it to his workbench. He spent the morning cutting and sanding, shaping the wood into a simple marker. Then, using a wood-burning tool he hadn't touched in years, he carefully burned letters into the surface. Joseph Carver, U.S. Army veteran, 1944, 2025, he loved. Well, it wasn't much, but it felt right. Carver deserved to be remembered, deserved more than a county burial with no marker. Walt planned to take the sign to the cabin, mount it somewhere visible. It was a small gesture, but Walt had learned that small gestures often carried the most weight. As he worked, Walt thought about legacy, what people left behind when they died. Carver had left Timber, had left a journal full of quiet observations and hard-won wisdom. Emma had left the ranch, the garden she'd tended, the memory of her laughter in every room. What would Walt leave? What would people remember about him? The question didn't have an easy answer, but for the first time in months, Walt wanted to figure it out. He wanted to matter again, to do something beyond just surviving. That afternoon, Walt called Michael in Seattle. His son answered on the third ring, surprised. "Dad, everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Walt said. "I just wanted to call. See how you're doing." There was a pause, as if Michael was recalibrating his expectations. "I'm good. Work's busy, but good. The kids are doing well. Emma just made honor roll." Emma, named after her grandmother. Walt felt warmth spread through his chest. "That's wonderful. Tell her I'm proud of her." "I will." Another pause. "How are you, Dad, really?" Walt looked at Timber, who lay by the wood stove, and at the marker he'd made, and at the journal on the table. "I'm doing better," he said honestly. "I got a dog. Big fellow named Timber. He's good company." Sarah mentioned that. "I'm glad." They talked for 20 minutes, longer than they'd talked in years. Michael told stories about the kids, about work projects and home repairs. Walt found himself relaxing into the conversation, asking questions, actually engaging instead of just enduring. When they hung up, Walt felt lighter, as if a knot had loosened somewhere deep inside. The next day, Walt and Timber drove back to the cabin. The road was familiar now, the mountains less forbidding. At the cabin, Walt mounted the marker on a post near the porch, where it would be visible to anyone who passed. It wasn't much, but it honored Carver, acknowledged that his life had mattered. Standing in the cold, Walt spoke aloud again. "You did good, Joseph. You raised a fine dog, and you trusted the right person. I hope you found peace." Timber sat beside him, patient and steady, and Walt felt the presence of both the man he'd lost and the man he'd never known, Emma and Joseph Carver. Two people who'd shaped his life in different ways. Back at the ranch that evening, Walt opened Emma's quilting basket for the first time since her death. Inside were half-finished projects, scraps of fabric, needles and thread. Emma had loved quilting, had made blankets for every important occasion, births, weddings, anniversaries. Her hands had been clever and patient, stitching together pieces into something beautiful. Walt didn't know how to quilt, but he carefully sorted through the basket, touching the fabrics Emma had chosen. He found one project she'd been working on before she got too sick, a simple pattern in blues and greens. Maybe, Walt thought, he could finish it. Maybe he could learn, could create something that honored her memory. The idea felt right, not dwelling in grief, but honoring it. Not preserving everything exactly as it was, but building something new from what remained. That night, Walt sat by the fire with Carver's journal one more time, reading the final entries again. One passage struck him particularly hard. I've learned that love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go and trusting that what you've built together will endure. Margaret's been gone for 40 years, but I still carry her with me. Not as weight, but as light. She taught me how to live with gentleness, how to see beauty in small things. That doesn't end because she did, and Timber, when my time comes, I'll have to let him go too. It'll hurt, but love always hurts when it's real. The hurt is proof that something mattered. Walt closed the journal and looked at Timber, who slept peacefully by the fire. The hurt Carver described, Walt felt it for Emma every day. But maybe Carver was right. Maybe the hurt was proof of something sacred, something that couldn't be diminished by death. He thought about the marker he'd made, about the phone call with Michael, about the quilting basket he was finally ready to open. These were small steps, but they were steps forward. For months, Walt had been frozen, unable to move past Emma's death. Now, because of a stranger's trust and a dog's loyalty, he was learning to walk again. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and quiet. Inside, the fire burned warm, and Walt sat in his chair with his hand on Timber's head, feeling connected to something larger than his own grief. He was part of a chain of people who'd loved and lost, who'd built lives and left legacies, who'd trusted others to carry forward what they couldn't finish themselves. Joseph Carver had trusted Walt, and Walt was discovering he was worthy of that trust. More than that, he was discovering he wanted to be, wanted to matter, wanted to build something meaningful with whatever years remained to him. "Thank you," Walt whispered, not sure if he was talking to Carver or Emma or Timber or the universe itself. But the gratitude was real, settling warm in his chest. And for the first time since Emma's death, Walt felt something close to hope. Deputy Karen Mills called on a Wednesday afternoon, her voice carrying an edge of excitement Walt rarely heard from her. "Walt, I found something. Can you come into town? It's about Joseph Carver." Walt made the drive with Timber, curiosity building with each mile. At the sheriff's office, Karen met him at the door, holding a manila envelope. The county was closing out Carver's file, she explained, leading him to a back room. They inventoried his personal effects, what little there was. Most of it's been disposed of, but they found this box of photographs in his shed. The clerk was going to throw them out, but she showed them to me first, and I saw something you need to see. She opened the envelope and pulled out several photographs, spreading them on the table. Most showed scenes Walt recognized from the cabin: Timber as a puppy, mountain landscapes, the seasons turning. But one photograph stopped Walt cold. It showed two young men in army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. The photo was old, the colors faded, but Walt recognized one of the men immediately. His father, Richard Granger, looking impossibly young, maybe 20 years old. The other man was Joseph Carver. Walt picked up the photograph with shaking hands. On the back, in faded ink, Rick and Joe, Fort Benning, 1963. "Your father and Carver served together," Karen said softly. "I checked military records after I saw this. They were in the same unit for basic training and infantry school, both deployed to Vietnam, though at different times." Walt stared at the photograph, his mind racing. His father had known Joseph Carver. They'd been friends, brothers in arms. And Walt had never known. "There's more," Karen said, pulling out another photograph. This one showed Walt's father, older now, standing in front of the Granger ranch house. The photo was dated 1978 on the back. "I think Carver visited your father after the war. I think they stayed in touch." Walt's legs felt weak. He sat down heavily in a chair. "My father never mentioned him. Never said a word about a friend named Joseph Carver. Did your father talk much about the war?" "No." Walt's voice was rough. "He never talked about it. Said that part of his life was done. No point dragging it up. His father had died in 1995, 30 years ago. A stroke, sudden and final. Walt had been 47 then, already running the ranch with Emma. His father had been a hard man, not unkind, but not demonstrative. He'd shown love through work, through teaching Walt how to mend fence and doctor cattle and read weather. Words had been sparse between them. Now Walt wondered what else had been left unsaid. Karen pulled out one more photograph, and this one made Walt's breath catch. It showed his father and Joseph Carver, both older men now, standing by a fence line that Walt recognized, the northern boundary of the Granger Ranch. They were both looking at the camera, both smiling slightly. On the back, last visit 1994. This was taken a year before your father died, Karen said. Carver must have visited him. Walt tried to remember 1994, tried to recall strangers at the ranch, but the years blurred together. He'd been busy that year. Michael had just finished college. Sarah was in high school. Emma's father had been sick. The ranch had demanded constant attention. Had someone visited his father that year? Walt couldn't say with certainty. Why didn't he tell me? Walt said quietly. Why didn't either of them tell me? Karen sat down across from him. Some men don't talk about what they went through. The war, losing people. Maybe they kept their friendship private because that's how they needed it to be. Walt looked at the photographs spread across the table, seeing his father's face in a new light. He'd known his father as a rancher, as a husband, as a parent. But there'd been a whole life before that, years of service, of war, of friendships forged in circumstances Walt couldn't imagine, and Joseph Carver had been part of that life. This changes everything, Walt said. Carver didn't choose me randomly. He chose me because of my father. Because they'd been friends, Karen nodded. Looks that way. Walt's mind turned over this new information, reframing everything he'd learned about Carver. The journal entries about watching Walt from a distance took on new meaning. Carver hadn't been watching a stranger. He'd been watching his friend's son, seeing Richard Granger in Walt's movements and routines. He reminds me of my father, Carver had written in the journal. Walt had assumed it was a general comparison, a character assessment. But now he understood. Carver had been writing about Walt's actual father, his friend, the man he'd served with. I need to read the journal again, Walt said. With this context, can I make copies of these photos? Karen asked. For your records. Yes, thank you. Karen left to make copies, and Walt sat alone with the photographs. He studied his father's young face, unlined, confident, full of life, and Joseph Carver beside him, equally young. These were men who'd faced death together, who'd survived things that broke other people. That created bonds that didn't fade, even across decades of separation. His father had never spoken about Carver, but that didn't mean the friendship hadn't mattered. Some things were too deep for words, too sacred to share. When Karen returned with copies, Walt thanked her and drove back to the ranch. Timber seemed to sense his emotional state, pressing close in the truck, offering silent comfort. At home, Walt spread the photographs on the kitchen table beside Carver's journal. He opened the journal to the sections where Carver mentioned Walt, reading them with new understanding. I watch Walt Granger work his land, and I see Rick in every movement. The way he walks the fence line, the way he handles his horses, the deliberate pace of his work. Rick taught him well. Rick would be proud of what his boy has built. Walt's throat tightened. His father, proud of him. He'd never been sure about that. Had always felt like he was falling short of some unspoken standard. But Carver had seen it, had recognized the continuity between father and son. Another entry, dated just a month before Carver's death. I've been thinking about Rick a lot lately. 30 years he's been gone, but I still miss him. We went through hell together, watched good men die, made it home when others didn't. That creates a debt to each other, to the ones who didn't make it. Rick kept his word always. I trust his son to do the same. Walt closed the journal, his vision blurred. Carver had chosen him not just because he seemed capable, but because he was Richard Granger's son. Because Carver trusted that the values his father had lived by would extend to the next generation. It was a weight and an honor, and Walt felt both pressing down on him. He thought about his father, the quiet man who'd raised him, who'd taught him everything about ranching and almost nothing about himself. What had his father experienced in Vietnam? What had he seen? What nightmares had he carried home and never shared? And what had it meant to him to have Joseph Carver as a friend, someone who understood without needing explanations? Walt wished he'd asked more questions, wished he'd pushed past his father's silence. But you didn't get second chances with the dead. You just had to live with what remained unsaid. That evening, Walt sat in his father's old chair, the one Richard Granger had occupied every night, the one Walt had avoided since Emma's death because it felt too final to claim it. Now he sat in it deliberately, feeling the worn leather that had conformed to his father's shape. Timber came and rested his head on Walt's knee, and Walt stroked the dog's ears, thinking about connections across time, fathers and sons, friends separated by distance, dogs who carried memories of people who were gone. Your person and my father were friends, Walt said quietly to Timber. They knew each other, trusted each other. That's why he sent you to me. Not because I earned it, but because of my father. Timber's tail thumped once, and Walt felt the weight of inheritance, not just land and buildings, but responsibilities and relationships that stretched back before he was born. He pulled out his phone and called Michael. "Dad?" Michael answered. "Twice in 1 week. You feeling okay?" "I need to tell you something," Walt said. "About your grandfather. About why I have Timber." He explained everything. Joseph Carver, the friendship with Richard Granger, the photographs, the connection that spanned generations. Michael listened without interrupting, and when Walt finished, there was a long silence. "Grandpa never talked about the war," Michael said finally. "I always wondered about that." "Me too, but he trusted his friend." "And his friend trusted you?" "Yes." Another pause. "That matters, Dad. That's legacy. That's what we pass down, not just property, but trust and character, and the belief that the people we raise will do the right thing." Walt felt warmth spread through his chest. "When did you get so wise?" Michael laughed softly. "I had a good teacher, even if he was quiet about it." They talked for a while longer, and when they hung up, Walt felt more connected to his son than he had in years. Maybe that was part of the lesson, that silence wasn't always strength, that sharing burdens made them lighter. Outside, night had fallen complete. Inside, Walt sat in his father's chair with Timber at his side, holding photographs of men who'd been young once, who'd faced unimaginable things and come home changed. His father had built a life after the war, had raised a family, had been a good man despite whatever scars he carried. And Joseph Carver had done his best too, had found peace in the mountains, had loved his wife and his dog with fierce loyalty. Now Walt carried both their legacies, the land his father had given him, the trust Carver had placed in him. It was a responsibility but also a gift, because it meant Walt's life mattered beyond just himself. It meant the choices he made echoed forward, affecting others he might never meet. He looked at the photographs one more time, his father's young face, Carver's steady gaze, the bond between them visible even in a faded picture. "I understand now," Walt said to the empty room, to the ghosts of men who'd shaped his life. "I understand why he chose me, and I won't let either of you down." The discovery of his father's connection to Joseph Carver changed something fundamental in Walt. He spent the next 2 weeks digging through old family papers, searching for more evidence of the friendship. In a box in the attic, he found letters his father had received over the years. Most were from relatives or business contacts, but tucked among them were 3 letters from Joseph Carver. The letters were brief, updates about life in the mountains, mentions of Margaret when she was alive, later mentions of Timber. The tone was warm but restrained, the way men of that generation wrote to each other, emotions present but controlled. The last letter was dated 1994, shortly before Walt's father died. "Rick, the mountains are good to me, but I miss our conversations. Miss having someone who understands without needing explanations. Your boy is doing well with the ranch. I drove by last week and saw him working cattle. You taught him right. When my time comes, I hope I'll have raised Timber half as well as you raised Walt." Walt read that line over and over, feeling the weight of his father's approval transmitted through a friend's observation. His father had been proud of him. It was a small thing, but it filled an empty space Walt hadn't known he was carrying. Sarah called on a Friday evening. "Michael told me about the photographs," she said without preamble. "About Grandpa and the man who owned timber." "Joseph Carver," Walt said. "They were friends. Close friends. Why didn't we know? Your grandfather didn't talk about those years." "I guess some men carry their history private." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry I pushed you so hard about the ranch. About moving. I was scared, and I wasn't listening to what you needed." Walt felt his chest tighten. "You were trying to take care of me. I understand that, but you don't need taking care of. You need space to grieve your own way." "Maybe," Walt said carefully. "But I also needed a push. Needed to start living again instead of just existing." Timber and finding out about Joseph Carver, that helped. They talked for over an hour, the longest conversation they'd had since Emma's funeral. Sarah told him about her work, about her kids, about struggles Walt hadn't known she was facing. And Walt shared more than he had in years, about the loneliness, about the grief that felt like drowning sometimes, about how having timber had given him reason to keep moving forward. When they hung up, Sarah said something that stayed with Walt. "Mom would be happy you're healing. She wouldn't want you frozen in place, Dad. She'd want you to keep living." Walt knew that was true. Emma had been practical about death, had made him promise before she died that he wouldn't stop taking care of himself. But knowing it and doing it were different things. The next morning, Walt woke with a sense of purpose. He made coffee, fed Timber, and then did something he'd been avoiding for months. He went to Emma's closet and looked through her clothes. Not to get rid of them. Not yet. But to touch them, to remember. Her favorite sweater, soft blue wool that she'd worn, until it was thin at the elbows. Her summer dresses, bright with flowers. Her winter coat, still carrying a faint trace of her perfume. Walt sat on the floor of the closet, holding the blue sweater, and let himself cry. Not the silent, stoic tears he'd shed at the funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. He cried for Emma, for the years they'd had, and the years they'd lost. He cried for his father, for conversations they'd never had. He cried for Joseph Carver, dying alone in the mountains, with only enough strength left to save his dog. Timber came and pressed against him, solid and warm, and Walt held onto the dog like an anchor. After a while, the crying stopped, leaving Walt empty but somehow cleaner, as if grief had been a wound that needed draining. He stood, joints aching, and carefully folded the sweater. Then he saw something else in the closet, Emma's jewelry box, small and wooden, sitting on the shelf. Walt opened it. Inside were the simple pieces Emma had favored. A silver bracelet, pearl earrings, her mother's locket, and her wedding ring, which she'd taken off when her hands got too thin, when the cancer made her fingers into twigs. Walt picked up the ring, gold worn smooth from 40 years of wearing. His own wedding ring still sat on his finger, and he touched it with his thumb, feeling the familiar weight. Emma had made him promise not to live in the past. She'd made him promise to keep the ranch going, to stay connected to their children, to find joy where he could. At the time, Walt had agreed because it made her feel better. Now he understood it was a gift, permission to move forward without guilt. He closed the jewelry box, the ring still in his palm, and walked downstairs. Timber followed, and together they went outside into the cold February morning. The ranch looked different to Walt now. Not just his burden, but his inheritance from his grandfather, his father, Emma, and in a strange way from Joseph Carver too. All these people had trusted him to carry forward what they'd built, to honor their work by continuing it. Walt spent the day doing maintenance work he'd been putting off, fixing a loose board on the porch, cleaning out the gutters, organizing the tack room. Timber stayed close, and Walt found himself talking to the dog the way he used to talk to Emma, working through thoughts aloud. "I need to visit her grave," Walt said, hammering a nail into place. "I haven't been since the funeral. I know that's wrong, but I couldn't face it." Timber's tail wagged encouragingly. "Maybe it's time," Walt continued. "Maybe I've been avoiding it, because once I go, once I stand there and say goodbye properly, It makes everything final. But wasn't it already final? Emma was gone. She'd been gone for 5 months. Not visiting her grave didn't change that. It just meant Walt was hiding from reality instead of facing it. That evening, Walt called both his children. "I'm going to visit your mother's grave on Sunday," he told them. "I wondered if you might want to be there." Michael said he couldn't make it. Too far, too short notice, but his voice was warm and supportive. Sarah said she'd drive up Saturday night, stay at the ranch, and go with him. After the calls, Walt sat in his father's chair and looked at Emma's wedding ring, still in his palm. He thought about marriage vows, for better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do us part. He'd kept those vows completely. Death had parted them. But love didn't end with death. It transformed, became something different but no less real. He looked at Timber, who gazed back with those steady dark eyes, and thought about the love Joseph Carver had shown. Love that let go, love that trusted others, love that made hard choices to ensure safety and care. That was the kind of love Walt wanted to honor. Not clinging love, not possessive love, but generous love that gave without demanding return. Saturday evening, Sarah arrived. She pulled up in her SUV just as the sun was setting, and Walt met her in the driveway. She hugged him hard, and Walt let himself lean into the embrace, feeling the comfort of his daughter's presence. "The ranch looks good," Sarah said, pulling back to look at him. "And you look good too, Dad. Different than at Thanksgiving." "I feel different," Walt admitted. Inside, Sarah made a fuss over Timber, who accepted her attention with dignified pleasure. They ate dinner together. Walt had made pot roast, Emma's recipe, and talked easily without the tension that had marked their recent interactions. "I'm sorry," Sarah said over coffee, "for pushing so hard about selling the ranch. I was scared, but that doesn't excuse not listening to you." "You're forgiven," Walt said simply. "You were trying to protect me. I can't fault you for that. Mom wouldn't want us fighting. No, she wouldn't." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Sarah said, "Tell me about Joseph Carver. Tell me what you've learned." Walt did, sharing the journal entries, the photographs, the connection to his father. Sarah listened with complete attention, and when Walt finished, she said, "That's beautiful, Dad. Sad, but beautiful. That he trusted you like that. It gave me purpose," Walt said, "when I needed it most. Maybe that's what your grandfather told him, that if anything happened, I'd be someone who'd do the right thing." "You are," Sarah said firmly. "You always have been." That night, Walt lay in bed with Timber on the floor beside him and felt more at peace than he had in months. Tomorrow he'd visit Emma's grave. Tomorrow he'd face the grief head-on instead of dancing around it. And Sarah would be there, his daughter who loved him, even when they disagreed. He thought about Emma's ring, still on his bedside table. He'd bring it tomorrow, decide what to do with it. But for now he let himself remember Emma's laugh, her capable hands, the way she'd looked at him like he was worth loving. Outside, winter held firm, but Walt could feel something shifting, some seasonal change in his soul. Spring was coming, not yet, but inevitable. All he had to do was hold on a little longer, keep the fire burning, trust that the cold would pass. Sunday morning broke clear and cold. The kind of day where the sky stretched endless and blue above the mountains. Walt dressed carefully, putting on the suit he'd worn to Emma's funeral, the only suit he owned. Sarah came downstairs already dressed in a dark coat, her eyes red like she'd been crying. They didn't talk much over breakfast, just moved around each other with the quiet understanding that comes from shared grief. Timber sensed something different in the air. He stayed close to Walt, pressing against his leg, offering silent support. "Can he come?" Sarah asked, nodding at Timber. "To the cemetery?" Walt considered. "I think he should. Emma would have liked him." They drove to town in Walt's truck, all three of them, Walt, Sarah, and Timber. The cemetery sat on a hill at the edge of Millerville, surrounded by an iron fence that had stood for over 100 years. Walt's grandparents were buried there, his parents, Emma, and spaces reserved for Walt and the children when their time came. Walt parked by the gates and sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, building courage. Emma's wedding ring sat in his coat pocket, a small weight that felt enormous. "We can take our time," Sarah said quietly. Walt nodded and got out. The cemetery was empty except for them, quiet under the winter sun. Snow covered everything, pristine and unmarked, except for deer tracks along the fence line. Timber walked between Walt and Sarah, his presence steadying both of them. Emma's grave was on the eastern side, under a pine tree. The headstone was simple granite, clean lines. Her name and dates carved neat and permanent. Emma Peterson Granger, 1953-2024. Beloved wife and mother. Walt stopped a few feet from the stone, unable to move closer. Sarah took his arm, lending him strength. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "And we brought Dad. He's been stubborn about visiting, but he's here now." Walt felt his throat close. He forced himself to step forward, to stand directly before the stone, to acknowledge the reality of earth and granite and the body of the woman he'd loved, buried 6 feet below. "Emma," he said, his voice rough. "I'm sorry it took me so long." The words came hard at first, then easier. He told her about Timber, about Joseph Carver and the connection to his father. He told her about the loneliness of the house without her, about how he'd been frozen in place until the dog appeared. He told her about reading Carver's journal, about understanding grief differently now. "I've been holding on too tight," Walt said, "to everything. To this idea that if I kept everything exactly like you left it, you'd still be here somehow. But you're not. You're gone, and I can't change that." Sarah was crying openly now, and Walt felt his own tears start. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Emma's wedding ring. "I don't know if I'm supposed to do this," he said. "Don't know what's right. But I brought your ring." He knelt in the snow, his old knees protesting, and pressed the ring into the earth at the base of the headstone. Not burying it, he'd come back in spring and do something more permanent, but leaving it there as an offering, as acknowledgement. "I'm going to keep living," Walt said. "I'm going to keep the ranch going, stay connected with the kids. I'm going to honor what we built together by not letting it die with you." He stayed kneeling, his hand on the cold stone, and felt something in his chest release, a knot that had been pulled tight since October finally loosening. The grief didn't disappear. It would never disappear, but it shifted, became something he could carry instead of something that carried him. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "She's proud of you." "Dad, I know she is." Timber came and sat on Walt's other side, pressed close, and Walt found himself surrounded by warmth, despite the cold. His daughter's love, the dog's loyalty, the memory of Emma's presence. "I love you," Walt said to the stone, to the woman beneath it, to the 40 years they'd shared. "I always will. But I'm going to let you rest now. I'm going to stop holding so tight and start living again." The cemetery was silent except for the wind in the pines. Walt stood helping Sarah up, and they stood together looking at the grave. The 3 of them, family in different forms, all carrying loss and learning how to bear it. "Thank you for coming," Walt said to Sarah. "Thank you for asking me," she replied. They stayed at the cemetery for another hour, talking to Emma's stone the way families do, sharing updates, telling stories. Remembering, Sarah told her mother about the kids, about her marriage, about struggles at work. Walt listened, learning things about his daughter's life he hadn't known, hadn't thought to ask. The distance between them hadn't been just physical. They'd both been carrying their grief privately, not wanting to burden each other. "I should have called more," Sarah said. "After the funeral. I should have checked on you. I should have let you," Walt replied. "I shut everyone out. Thought I had to handle it alone." "We're Grangers," Sarah said with a small smile. "We're stubborn about asking for help." Walt recognized the truth in that. His father had been the same, self-reliant to a fault, uncomfortable with vulnerability. It was part of their heritage, passed down like the land itself. But maybe some inheritances needed to be examined, revised. "I'm going to try to do better," Walt said. "Keep in touch more. Visit Denver maybe, meet your family properly." Sarah's eyes lit up. "The kids would love that. They barely know you, Dad, and that's—" She stopped, reconsidered. "That's my fault too. I didn't push for visits because I thought you wanted to be alone. I did want to be alone. But wanting something and needing it aren't the same. They walked slowly through the cemetery, reading other stones, noting names Walt recognized from town. So many people buried here, each one a life lived, relationships formed, legacies left behind. The weight of all that history felt comforting instead of oppressive, a reminder that grief was universal, that everyone who'd ever loved had eventually lost. Near the gate, they stopped at Richard Granger's grave, Walt's father. The stone was weathered, lichen growing on the north side, but the engraving remained clear. Sarah stood beside Walt, and he realized she'd been young when her grandfather died, only 11 years old. "I wish I'd known him better," Sarah said. "He was always kind to me, but distant, like there was this wall I couldn't get through." "He had walls," Walt agreed. "Things from the war he never talked about. But he was a good man. Taught me everything about ranching, about keeping your word, about responsibility. And you taught me the same things," Sarah said. "Maybe that's how we pass down what matters, not by talking about it constantly, but by living it." Walt thought about Joseph Carver, about how he'd watched Walt from a distance and seen Richard Granger's values reflected in his son's actions. Maybe that was the truest form of legacy, not words or possessions, but character passed down through example. "Your grandfather and Joseph Carver were friends," Walt said. "Brothers, really. They went through things together I can't imagine, and even though they didn't see each other often, that bond lasted until they died. That's worth something." "It's worth everything," Sarah said. They stood in silence for a while, and then Walt said something he'd been thinking about since finding the photographs. "I'm going to put up a marker for Joseph Carver next to my father's grave. They should be together." "It's what both of them would have wanted," Sarah nodded. "That's good, Dad, that's right." On the drive back to the ranch, Sarah asked, "What are you going to do with the ranch? Long term?" Walt had been thinking about that question for weeks. "Keep it running as long as I can. When I can't anymore, I'll figure something out. Maybe Michael or you would want it someday, or maybe it'll go to someone else who'll appreciate it. But I'm not ready to let go yet." "I'm glad," Sarah said. "It's where you belong." Back at the ranch, Sarah made lunch while Walt tended the horses. Timber followed him to the barn, and Walt found himself talking to the dog about the morning, about the release he'd felt at Emma's grave. "I think I'm going to be okay," he told Timber. "Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. And that's because of you, because of what your person did. Joseph Carver saved me by trusting me with you." Timber's tail wagged, and Walt scratched behind his ears, feeling gratitude so profound it bordered on reverence. That afternoon, Sarah prepared to leave. They hugged in the driveway, holding on longer than usual. "Come visit soon," Sarah said. "And call me. Not just when something's wrong, but just to talk." "I will," Walt promised. He watched her drive away, then turned and looked at his ranch, the house, the barn, the mountains beyond. It all felt different now, lighter somehow. The weight of grief remained, but it no longer crushed him. He could carry it, could live with it, could even find meaning in it. Timber pressed against his leg, and Walt rested his hand on the dog's head. Together they walked back into the house, into the warmth, into whatever came next. Spring came slowly to Montana, the way it always did. One warm day followed by 3 cold ones, snow melting and refreezing. The promise of green struggling against winter's stubbornness. Walt stood in his workshop on a warm April morning, putting finishing touches on a granite marker he'd commissioned for Joseph Carver. The stone matched his father's, same size, same style, with an inscription Walt had labored over for weeks. Joseph Carver, 1944, 2025 U.S. Army veteran, faithful friend. He loved well beside the marker sat a smaller stone, something Walt had carved himself from a piece of pine. It read, "Brothers in arms, together again." Today, Walt would install both markers at the cemetery. The county had agreed to let Carver be remembered alongside Richard Granger, a gesture that felt profoundly right. Timber lay in a patch of sunlight by the workshop door, Older now, moving a bit slower, but still steady and faithful. 5 months had passed since that frozen February morning when he'd appeared at Walt's gate. 5 months that had changed everything. Walt loaded the markers carefully into his truck, As he worked, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the depths of grief to something like acceptance, from isolation to connection, from merely surviving to actually living again. The house no longer felt like a museum. Emma's quilting basket sat open in the living room, her projects visible but not untouchable. Walt had finished the blue and green quilt she'd started, though his stitches were clumsy compared to hers. The quilt now covered their bed, a symbol of continuation, of honoring the past while moving forward. Emma's photograph still held pride of place on the mantel, but now it was surrounded by others. Pictures of the kids, of Walt's parents, of Joseph Carver and Richard Granger in their army days. The house held memory without being trapped by it. Walt and Timber drove to town. The April sun felt warm through the windshield, and the valley was starting to show green in patches. Calves had been born, colts were running in pastures, and everything carried that sense of renewal that spring brought. At the cemetery, Deputy Karen Mills was waiting. She'd helped arrange for Carver's marker, had pulled strings with the county to make it happen. Jim Morrison from the feed store was there too. Having heard what Walt was doing and wanting to pay respects, together, the four of them, Walt, Karen, Jim, and Timber, stood in the spring sunshine while Walt set the markers in place. Joseph Carver's stone went beside Richard Granger's, with the smaller pine marker between them. "I never met Joseph Carver," Karen said when the work was done. "But from what I've learned, he was a good man who did a hard thing. He made sure his dog was cared for, and in doing so, he gave you something you needed." "He did," Walt agreed, "more than he could have known." Jim Morrison cleared his throat, uncomfortable with emotion but determined to speak. "Your father was a good man too, Walt, one of the best I knew. I'm glad his friend is here beside him." After Karen and Jim left, Walt sat on a bench near the graves, with Timber at his feet. He'd brought Emma's wedding ring back from where he'd left it in February. Now he walked to her stone and placed it in a small metal box he'd mounted at the base, weatherproof and secure. The ring would stay there, a permanent offering, a symbol of 40 years of love. "I'm doing better," he told Emma's stone. "The kids call regularly now. Sarah's bringing the grandkids to visit this summer. Michael's planning a trip in the fall. The ranch is running well, and I've got Timber to keep me company." He paused, looking at the three graves, Emma, his father, Joseph Carver, three people who'd shaped his life in profound ways, who'd taught him about love and loss and legacy. "I understand now," Walt said quietly, "about letting go, about trusting others, about how the hardest thing in life is learning to trust after you've lost everything." Those were the words from the note, from that first morning. They'd seemed abstract then, philosophical. Now Walt understood them in his bones. Trust required courage when you'd been hurt. Love required vulnerability when you'd experienced loss. Living required faith when grief made you want to retreat. Joseph Carver had shown that courage by sending Timber away. Emma had shown it by making Walt promise to keep living. And Walt was showing it now by opening his heart again, by staying connected to his children, by allowing himself to heal. Back at the ranch that evening, Walt sat on the porch with Timber, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was warm enough that he didn't need a coat, and the smell of awakening earth carried on the breeze. Inside, dinner was cooking. He'd learned to cook properly over the winter, had stopped living on cold sandwiches and canned soup. Tomorrow Sarah would call, and Wednesday Michael had scheduled a video chat so Walt could see the grandkids. Next week, Walt was driving to the VFW hall in town for their monthly dinner, something he hadn't done since Emma died. Life was filling in again, slowly but surely, like grass growing over a burn scar. Timber shifted beside him, resting his head on Walt's knee, and Walt stroked the dog's graying muzzle. They'd both gotten older these past months, had both carried grief and found their way through it together. "Your person did good," Walt said. "Joseph Carver. He trusted the right cowboy, and I'm grateful every day that he did." Timber's tail thumped twice against the porch boards, the same patient, knowing gesture he'd made that first morning at the gate. Walt looked out at the ranch, at the barn his father had built, at the mountains that had witnessed 3 generations of Grangers working this land. He thought about legacy, about what he'd leave behind when his time came. Not just property, but something more. The proof that grief could be survived, that trust could be honored, that love continued even after loss. The sun touched the mountain peaks, painting them golden orange. Soon it would be dark, and Walt would go inside to dinner and an evening by the fire with timber at his feet. Tomorrow would bring morning chores and work to be done, phone calls with his children, and the steady rhythm of ranch life. It was a good life, Walt realized. Not the same life he'd had with Emma, but good nonetheless. Different, quieter in some ways, but full of meaning and connection and purpose. Sometimes the hardest thing in life was learning to trust after losing everything. But sometimes, if you were very lucky, a giant dog appeared at your gate with a note tied to his collar, and that trust was rewarded. Sometimes grief led to healing, and loneliness led to connection, and a dying man's final act of love became a living man's reason to keep going. Walt sat on his porch as darkness fell, his hand on Timber's head, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Not happiness exactly, but something deeper and more durable. Peace with what had been, acceptance of what was, and hope for what might still come. The Montana stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light, and in the quiet of the valley, Walt Granger and the dog who'd saved him sat together. Two souls who'd found each other in the cold, who'd learned to trust again, who'd discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come from strangers we never meet.